This is Business Edge. I'm Tolulope Adela Balogun. The European Union wants to change the way it does trade with the African continent. Can African countries use this opportunity to get the best deal possible? And Zimbabwe is making new efforts to tackle its inflation with a triple-digit interest rate hike. We'll have the details later on in the show. We'll also be looking at how the cryptocurrency market has responded after the lows and shakeups of the last few weeks. But let's get started with African business headlines. Libya's state oil company says it may suspend exports from the Gulf of Sirte, which contains many of the OPEC members' main ports, in the next 3 days amid a worsening political crisis. The National Oil Corporation said it could declare force majeure, a clause in contracts allowing shipments to be halted within 72 hours. The Gulf of Sirte includes the export terminals of Es Sader, Ras Lanouf, Brega, and Zuitine. Now, Libya's crude oil production has roughly halved since mid-April to 600,000 barrels a day, according to some estimates. This has further tightened the global oil market, in which prices have surged 45% this year to around $110 a barrel, mostly due to the fallout of Russia's invasion of Ukraine. Figures released by the Nigerian National Petroleum Companies show that the amount spent as subsidy on premium motor spirit, popularly called petrol, and on refinery rehabilitation between January and May this year was 1.301 trillion naira. The company's latest presentation to the Federation Account Allocation Committee meeting for the month of June showed that the bulk of the oil firm's spending was on petrol subsidy, as it consumed 1.274 trillion naira during the 5-month period, while for refinery rehabilitation, the NNPC spent 9.11 billion naira in each of the months of January, March, and April, amounting to 27.33 billion naira. And staying in West Africa, the Ghana Ports and Harbors Authority is predicting a possible drop of between 20 to 25% of cargo berths at the port this year, especially cargoes that come into the country from the Russia-Ukraine regions. Michael Lugeji, the authority's Director General, explained that data gathered from shippers indicates that due to the effect of the Russia-Ukraine war, cargo traffic into the country would dip, as about 25% of wheat and fertilizer imports into the country were from Russia and Ukraine. In the southern part of the continent, the South African rand gained against the dollar in early trade on Tuesday as the U.S. currency dipped on less aggressive rate hike bets. It started trade at 15 rand 81 cents against the dollar, around 0.2% higher than its previous close. The dollar index, which measures the currency versus 6 rivals, fell slightly to 103.94. Some of the heat has come out of bets on U.S. interest rate raises, with the peak in the Federal Reserve's benchmark funds rate now seen hovering around 3.5% next year rather than 4% or higher. But the dollar has not yet fallen far from its lofty peaks. In East Africa, the Kenya Revenue Authority is banking on its new tax invoice management system to increase VAT collections to 35% of total tax revenue, even as the system seeks to boost tax compliance in small businesses. All businesses are expected to have migrated to the new electronic register that captures and sends to the taxman all transactions in real time by August 1st, 2022. You're watching Business Edge right here on News Central. Up next, the conversation as how the European Union Parliament is seeking to revamp and refresh its trade partnerships with the continent. It's time for change. Stay with us. Recently, the European Parliament voted to update and revamp its trade deals with Africa. This comes after reports written by the EU Commission on International Trade makes a set of recommendations for future investments in Africa based on promises of a more equal, respectful, and human-centered trade partnership between the two entities. Now, the reports, which now passes to the European Commission for consideration and possible resolution, calls for fairer treatment of African countries in their current bilateral trade agreements. How can Africa ensure that the countries of the continent get the best deal? Let's look at how the EU is working on new trade partnerships with Africa. Now joining me from Nairobi, Kenya is Ali Khan Sachu, Africa geoeconomist and macro analyst, as well as the CEO of Rich Management. Ali Khan, welcome once again to Business Edge. Thank you so much for joining me.
Thank you for having me.
So the votes that happened and the agreement to look at how they can update the engagement, particularly trade engagements with the continent, sort of presupposes that things have not been done in a fair, equal, and respectful manner in previous times. So what would be your assessment of where things stand?
So I think, the European Union is always in two minds about the continent. It tends to look at the continent through a security and immigration lens. And in the last few days, we've had those events at the Spanish border, which have been truly horrific. And I think then beyond that, the European Union understands that they have to engage with Africa meaningfully. And I think they're accepting the point that over the last 2 decades, they've lost considerable ground with the continent, of course, China being front and center of that. And I think they're trying to find, find a new level of engagement which works for the next couple of decades. I'm not sure that they have found that new level, but at least they're trying to get there.
So for centuries, we've seen the European Union, and not just them, of course, as you mentioned, Russia and China. The hand that has been extended towards the continent has been one that reduced the continent to a supplier of raw materials. And you talked about how they may be reacting now to the Russia and the Chinese influence that's being exerted on the continent. Beyond that, what do you think is also pushing this sort of extension of a new handshake that we're getting from the European Union?
Well, I think those 2 points you just touched on are very important. And unfortunately, we saw that even the G7, for example, was reacting to what China has already done with the Belt and Road Initiative and tried to create a version 2 of the same thing. But beyond that, I think, other catalysts which are creating this impetus are the need to secure energy supplies in Europe. I think the understanding that if Europe does not help in creating jobs in Africa, the Europeans are going to have to deal with more Africans on their border. And therefore, I think there is an attempt here now to try and sort of lift the trade engagement and go up the value chain. And I think that those are the key drivers of this new sort of refreshed approach to the continent. But the proof is ultimately in the pudding. I mean, you can keep reinventing the plan, but unless you execute it, it's practically meaningless.
All right, so let's look at what this vote is on. So the vote on the future of EU-Africa trade relations is focusing on 5 key themes: infrastructure, food security, civil society, fair trade agreements, and sustainable economic development. Now, among the proposals outlined is a call for the EC not to propose new economic partnership agreements before evaluating their impact on African economies. The current EPAs negotiated between the EU and African countries are largely based on the Cotonou Agreement that was signed in 2000, which has long been described as a kiss of death. Now, when you look at that for African countries, and particularly in how it created unfair competition for African agriculture, if you could venture a guess, did the current economic partnership agreements really benefit African countries? How do we assess them before we move forward to the next ones?
So I think specifically what you're pointing out is the fact that the European Union subsidizes its farmers with an enormous level of subsidy. And therefore, a lot of food exports out of Europe into Africa have basically unfairly competed with Africa's own farm production, compromising Africa's food security. And I think that's where, there have been other issues, but I think that issue has been the main one. And Africa needs better protection against that. So I think that's what, everyone is aware of and everyone is trying to resolve. And of course, we've got this whole food security situation, which is front and center. Food prices are at record highs, although they've come off in the last couple of weeks, but I expect them to go higher. And I think there is a genuine sense that, one has got to look at how we stabilize the continent. And the first pillar of any stability is you've got to be able to feed your people. So I think that's why we've got this focus, particularly on the food side.
And to follow up with that, the European Union Parliament also noted the high dependency of African countries on food imports. And they've said that they've also seen that harmful competition for small-scale agriculture on the continent. The recommendation there is to relocate economic activities to the continent. Do you think this is the way to go? And does this seem like they're looking for cheaper labor for some of their production? Because there are concerns as to what that really translates to for young people and, of course, for the continent as well.
So that's another interesting point. Of course, Africa's been caught in the crosshairs of this Ukraine-Russia European situation because a number of African countries are very dependent on imports, particularly from Ukraine and from Russia. So I think, that's why this issue has become so important. The idea of moving production onto the continent is something that a lot of other countries are also looking at. The UAE, for example, Turkey, have leased vast tracts of land on the continent. But they're looking at food security for themselves as opposed to African food security. And I think if I can give any credit to the European Union, it would be on the basis that they're actually actively looking at our food security as opposed to their own. Now, regarding cheap labor, of course, this has been a story for quite a while, that even China, for example, would look to move production onto the continent because the Chinese standard of living had gone up so high. It was an opportunity for Africa to do what China did 30 or 40 years ago. But really, we haven't seen that much action on that front. I haven't seen huge amounts of movement, production being positioned on the continent. So I think there's more room to do that. But ultimately, I think, Europe is looking at its own interests and trying to align its Africa story with those interests.
All right, Ali Khan, we're going to take a break. So we'll look at what Africa's interests are in this and what would free and fair trade relations with the EU look like for African countries. The conversation continues after this. Still with me is Ali Khan Sachu, Africa geoeconomist and macro analyst, as we look at the EU extending a new hand of trade and partnership to the continent. Now, as trade and climate become increasingly intertwined, the report by the European Union Committee demands that the European Commission reconsider Europe's carbon border adjustment mechanism for African imports. Now, this mechanism is designed to lower carbon emissions globally by preventing industries from transferring polluting production to non-EU countries or replacing EU products with more carbon-intensive imports. However, under the scheme, African exporters would face higher taxes even though emissions from African countries are the lowest globally. A recent study by the Center for Global Development shows that Mozambique's GDP would fall by 1.6% under Europe's mechanism, as the southern African country is a substantial exporter of aluminum to the EU. Now, this is yet another example of how EU policies have and are affecting the continent. Ali Khan, so my question to you here would be, why have we not seen a collective pushback against some of these policies that affect African exporters to the EU? We've been trying to up our trade. We've been looking for ways to do things, and we're getting those things done in certain instances and with certain countries, but policies are in the way. So how the EU speaks with one voice, why has the continent not been speaking with one voice as well in pushing back against some of these policies that hurt us?
So that's a great point, and I think that's one of our challenges, is that we don't speak with a single voice, and it's very easy, therefore, to divide and rule us. And I think it's really important that we come to these very big meetings, continental level meetings where we're negotiating with a single voice. your point is very important. You know, Africa is hardly responsible for, very little of the pollution that the world is currently wrestling with. And we are actually one of the continents that's most affected by the backwash from this pollution. Look at what's happening in the Sahel, global warming. It's creating enormous challenges for the African continent. And I think, therefore, this is a perfect example of where Africa should be saying, why are you penalizing us when we've hardly created any of this problem? And therefore, you've got to give us a more generous treatment than you would necessarily give others. And I think that would be a classic example of what needs to be argued at the highest level in order to deal with this. Because the Europeans are very good at sanitizing themselves and introducing laws which would be very, very negative. As you said, Mozambique being one example, but that example probably applies all across the continent.
So from there, who then should we look for to negotiate for us? Because the EU Parliament is going to look at these trade partnership and deals with Africa as a bloc. There are 54 countries that have 54 varying and differing interests at some points in time. So who is going to be at the front and center before we're handed deals and trade again that really do not benefit us?
Well, if you look at things like the African Free Trade Agreement, that was an agreement that aligned these 54 countries we're talking about successfully. So it's not something that I'm bearish about. I'm just saying we've got to get better organized. So you can use that kind of platform. You could probably use the African Union platform, and you could probably use the likes of the African Development Bank to coordinate and synchronize the position. So I think, we have the capacity, we have the institutions. It's just a question of now better organizing ourselves in order to speak with that one voice. I think once we do that, I think we'll get much, much better and more optimal outcomes in our engagements, particularly with the European Union.
So you did bring up the issue of immigration earlier and the fact that if the EU doesn't, in a way, assist the continent to create jobs here, they will see more Africans on their border. But some have even brought up that as a criticism against the EU and even partnerships like the Commonwealth. If the EU is looking to revamp, refresh, renew its trade partnerships with the continent, is this not a good time for Africa to put the issues of the impediments of mobility and migration on the table?
Absolutely. I think, there is no better time to do that. We've seen how the European Union treats different people differently. I mean, anyone from Ukraine, for example, without any documentation is being welcomed into Europe. Africans, meanwhile, you've seen how they're being treated at the border in the last 48 hours. So we have to bring this subject up. It's vital that we deal with it. And get the Europeans to deal with Africans with some level of dignity. Otherwise, we're just going to be locked out of the continent. Only our best people will be let in because they are providing a service. And this engagement will never move really beyond what it's looked like for the last 100 years. So this is absolutely the appropriate time to be dealing with it, and to be finding a mechanism which works for both them and for us.
All right, so finally, Ali Khan Sachu, on this, when it comes to what fair trade relations with with Africa and the European Union look like, what do they look like to you?
So fair trade relations look like a lot more value addition, a lot more investment by the Europeans on the continent. Obviously, there's going to be a lot more investment in things like oil and gas. I mean, it's obvious where the direction of travel is going. As Europe seeks to dilute the influence of Russia, it's going to look at the African continent much more. But I think essentially it's not about uplifting raw material. It's about creating the value addition in country. Give you an example. Take the DR Congo. The DR Congo has all the raw materials to drive the next century. How many factories are there in the DR Congo? How many people are being employed in value additive jobs in the Congo? And this is something that needs to be looked at. And I think this is what I would like to see more of. And then, obvious things like coffee and cocoa. just to give you two examples, I think our coffee farmers supply and our cocoa farmers supply like half of the world's supply of coffee and cocoa, and they earn about 1% of the total income. That clearly cannot go on. We've got to find ways to create value on the continent, and I think the Europeans would be well advised to help us in achieving that.
All right, Ali Khan, thank you so much for joining me on this conversation. I know you're sticking around as we look at what's happening in Zimbabwe, so I'll see you in just a bit. All right, international business news is coming up after the break, and then we touch base with Zimbabwe, where news this morning, triple-digit interest rate hikes to deal with rising inflation and cost. Stay with us. And here are some of the big stories on the international business scene. Now, data from the Banking and Payments Federation of Ireland shows that mortgage switching volumes and values more than doubled in year-on-year terms, reaching their highest level in at least a decade. The latest figures from the BPFI's mortgage approvals report for May show that there were 5,355 mortgage approvals valued at 1.5 billion euros. Mortgage approval volumes for property purchase increased by 0.7% year-on-year to 3,841, valued at 1.1 billion euros. Ukrainian grain exports in the first 22 days of June fell by around 44% from a year earlier to 1.11 million tons. According to data from the Agriculture Ministry, it showed volumes included 978,000 tons of corn, 104,000 tons of wheat, and 24,000 tons of barley. Ukraine the Ukraine exported up to 6 million tons of grain a month before Russia launched an invasion on February the 24th. Scottish energy firm SSE and Norwegian petroleum refining company Equinor have jointly agreed to acquire Salt End Power Station operator Triton Power Holdings from Energy Capital Partners for a total of £341 million, shared equally between the partners. SSE says the transaction undertaken by its SSE Thermal division represented another step forward for the pair's existing collaboration, supporting the long-term decarbonization of the UK's power system, while contributing to the security of supply and grid stability through flexible power generation in the shorter term. In addition to the 1.2 gigawatt combined cycle gas turbine and combined heat and power facility in East Yorkshire, the acquired portfolio also includes Indian Queen's Power Station. The transaction is expected to be completed in September, subject to UK national security filings and EU merger control. Ericsson has announced today that closing of its $6.2 billion Vonage acquisition was delayed to the end of July from the first half of the year due to a pending investigation by a U.S. national security panel. The Swedish telecom equipment maker has agreed to buy cloud communications firm Vonage in an all-cash deal in November as part of its efforts to broaden its 5G portfolio. But since then, Ericsson has faced a bribery scandal in Iraq that has led to the U.S. Department of Justice and the Securities and Exchange Commission opening investigations against the company. Lithium producer Sayona Mining and its U.S.-based partner Piedmont Lithium have approved the restarting of their spodumene plant in Canada at a cost of 98 million Canadian dollars. Now, shares of Sayona Mining jumped, hitting their highest since June 7th, while the broader market rose more than 0.5%. The proposed upgrade and restart of the Quebec-based North American lithium operation has been funded through cash contributions by both Sayona and Piedmont Lithium. Piedmont has a 25% stake in Sayona Quebec, the Sayona mining unit, which owns North American Lithium. And now we continue our conversation to a developing story coming out of Zimbabwe that we're following very closely. This is Business Edge.